Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, I haven't been making very many episodes lately on this channel, and that's because, as some of you may know, my mom has had Alzheimer's disease for a long time, and just recently, um, her health declined to the point where it was clear that she wasn't going to be around much longer. So, I went and visited her, and unfortunately, she did recently pass away. Um, but in any case, today I wanted to talk about what seems to be a lot of people on the left's favorite subject lately for, in my opinion, completely the wrong reasons, and that is Israel. And specifically, I want to talk about um, claims that people who are opposed to the vaccines have made with regard to Israel, where they're constantly bringing up Israel as a supposed example of how the vaccines for COVID don't work very well. And so not only do they cherry pick data from Israel, which happens to have a moderately high vaccination rate, not as high as people think it is, um, and also a high rate of COVID infections right now. So if I'm going to do a whole episode about Israel that isn't about Israeli treatment of the Palestinians, I've got to preface it by saying, Israel's still an apartheid state, still an ethno-fascist state. So, you see a lot of things like this. Um, and, it's still evicting Palestinians from their homes, destroying those homes. It's still stealing land, still bombing Gaza, even though this isn't reported on the news like it was back in May. Um, so, fuck Israel. Um, And, even independent lefty media outlets and leftists on social media generally, at least in the U.S., have had little to say about Israel lately. Um, you know, even though, just the other day there was an episode where, sorry, let's see if I can find it. Israeli troops fired on a bunch of Palestinian protesters in the West Bank, wounded hundreds of them. Uh, there was an episode where um, the Israeli Navy opened fire on fishermen fishing off the coast of Gaza. Uh, Israel's been bombing Gaza. They've been bombing the Golan Heights in Syria. They've been evicting people from their homes in East Jerusalem. All of these things that they were doing back in May when this was getting national news coverage here in the United States. They're doing now. But for some reason, all that leftists on social media seem to want to talk about lately with regard to Israel is to use Israel as a supposed demonstration that COVID vaccines aren't effective. So to those people, I want to say, first of all, get your priorities straight and put your focus back on the subject of Israeli apartheid and ethnic cleansing and really genocide in many respects if you're going to be talking about Israel. And secondly, you're quite wrong about whether the data from the Israeli Ministry of Health and Israeli scientists suggests that the vaccines are not effective. So, I wanted to just give you an example of this kind of rhetoric. Um, so this fellow who goes by the handle unapologetic, who I've watched a few of his shows on YouTube, and I generally agree very much with him. but he seems to be an anti-vaxxer, and uh, says stuff like this. A lot of logical inconsistencies coming from people on the left who are typically critical and mistrustful of powerful institutions that have abused public trust, but now are browbeating people for not trusting those same lying institutions about the vax that they also lie about. Well, I mean, it's not about trusting institutions. It's about looking at scientific data. You from research conducted by scientists who are merely trying to find out the truth about, in this case, how well vaccines are working. And so I asked him, what lies about the vax do you think have been told and who has told them? And he said a recent lie has been that booster shots will make the vaccine better, with zero evidence or studies to back that up. And so I said, that isn't true that there's no evidence to back that up. Here's one study, and there are others. And I showed a graphic of the results of that study. So then this fellow, Charles Anderson, who's actually more of a libertarian than a leftist, and I know him from when he and I and some other folks used to do YouTube shows together. But he's against the vaccines, and he says, let's see. First, we were told herd immunity could be HEARD could be achieved when 70% were vaccinated, and now they keep making the number higher. Or we could turn to Israel, since they did well in getting everyone vaxxed, and now the people overrunning their hospitals are vaccinated people. So, the reason that scientists and government bureaucrats who are scientists like Anthony Fauci as well have raised the bar on what constitutes herd immunity is obviously we have a much more contagious variant of COVID-19 predominant right now. Delta variant is more than twice as infectious as original COVID. So obviously it's going to take more in terms of people having immunity, whether it's from the vaccines or from natural infection, for herd immunity, the threshold at which the virus can't find enough people to infect to keep increasing in numbers and eventually dies out, is going to be like 85% or 90% or something like that. But getting back to his claim, he says everyone, they did well in getting everyone vaxxed in Israel, and now the people overrunning their hospitals are vaccinated people. Well, let's see how many people Israel actually did get vaccinated. So here you see a list of countries' vaccination rates. The highest, the country with the highest number of people fully vaccinated is not Israel. Excuse me, but Malta. Israel isn't even in the top 10. In fact, Israel is down here, tied with Cyprus, just ahead of Sweden, about 25th in terms of its vaccination rate. And it looks like probably other countries are going to catch up with them too, and pass Israel. So it's nowhere near. It's got like 20% lower percentage of its population vaccinated than other countries that are at the top. So there's a little less than 39% of Israelis who are unvaccinated. And that's on top of 89% of Palestinians being unvaccinated, And even though the Gaza Strip is basically cut off from the outside world by the Israeli blockade, the West Bank is not. So Palestinians and Israelis do encounter each other. And you know, one thing that doesn't get talked a lot about is the fact that Israel is basically engaged in vaccine apartheid, just as it's engaged in apartheid in other respects, and has prevented Palestinians from getting sufficient access to the vaccines. That's the main reason why they have such a low vaccination rate. And this is, of course, not something specific to Israel, but just in general, the West has been hoarding vaccines for themselves, and uh, people in the global South in most countries, not all of them, but most, have had very little access to the vaccine so far, compared to countries like the U.S. and Israel and Western Europe, European countries, and so forth. Um, but so this guy goes on to say, people, they said people need a third and fourth shot in Israel now because it's wearing off, not to mention the fact that with each new variant, it has less and less effect on the variants. But there were no clinical tests done to see what the short or long term effects are of taking 3+ shots. Um, and, none of what he says here is true, other than that, yes, Israel has said, given the length of time since um, most people in Israel were double vaxxed. A lot of people will need booster shots to boost their immunity against infection back up. And they did, of course, do clinical trials, as countries always do before they start vaccinating people. And I said, it's not true that the vax is having less and less effect. Average efficacy against infection with Delta is 82%. Um, and much higher than that against severe illness. Um, and I'll post a link to the review article that I found that has a figure listing all the recent studies on vaccine efficacy and finding that indeed, on average, it's about 82% against the Delta variant. Um, But I mean, what about Israel's high case rate? It's got a higher current rate of COVID cases than the United States, something like 6,000 per million in Israel versus about 3,000 per million in the United States, even though Israel has a slightly higher vaccination rate than the U.S., a bit over 61% of its population vaccinated versus 54% vaccinated in the United States. So, why is that? Well, it's hard to say for sure, but probably, it's a combination of the Delta variant hitting Israel back in June at basically the same time that they lifted all of their restrictions. Like they didn't even have an indoor mask mandate, and they opened in-person schooling back up. Um, and as I said before, the majority of their vaccines were given more than 5 or 6 months ago. The country with the highest percentage of vaccines given that long ago of any country. And also, there's evidence to suggest that when you space the first and second doses of a vaccine close together, that gives you less boost to your immune system, less efficacy than if they're spaced farther apart. And Israel only spaced its vaccines the minimum that Pfizer recommended. They mainly use Pfizer, which is 3 weeks. They've also got, as I said before, a huge population of unvaccinated Palestinians, low vaccination rate there. schools in Israel were open in May and June. Uh, then they reopened in early September. They um, supposedly have some restrictions now where you can't do certain things if you're not vaccinated, but my understanding is they don't really enforce that very well at all, or even necessarily mask mandates very well, which they did re-implement toward the end of June. Um, but let's take a look at some data from Israel to show that, in fact, the vaccines are actually doing a pretty good job of reducing the rate of infections, hospitalizations, severe illness, and death in Israel. And their numbers would be a lot worse if they were not vaccinating a lot of people. So at one point back in August, in fact, vaccinated people accounted for about roughly half of their new cases. That's no longer the case, but there was one blip in the data there that anti-vax people certainly latched onto. Well, a number of things accounted for that. First of all, it had been so long since elderly people in particular had been vaccinated in Israel. Their immune systems don't work as well as younger people's. So the vaccine helps them, but their baseline level of immunity is still actually less than that of unvaccinated young people, which sounds odd, but it's true. So let me just show you figures on this here. So this is a graphic of the rate of severe illness of different age groups in Israel. I've shown you this in previous episodes, but as you can see, for every level of vaccination, people who are fully vaxxed have a much lower rate of severe disease, severe COVID per 100,000 people than unvaccinated people. So for people who are above 70, for example, there's roughly a 10 times as high rate of severe disease for unvaccinated elderly people than for vaccinated elderly people. Not quite so much for 80 to 89. That's a little over 5 times as high a rate of severe disease. And again, it's true for every age group. So that's one thing to bear in mind. The other thing is the more people are vaccinated in a population or in a given subgroup of the population, the more in absolute numbers sick people who are vaccinated there are going to be. The easiest way to think about this is just to imagine the two extremes. In one case, if nobody's vaccinated, then everyone who gets sick, by definition, is an unvaccinated person. On the other hand, if 100% of the population is vaccinated, then, again, by definition, everybody who gets sick will be someone who was vaccinated. So, the question isn't how many sick people are vaccinated, but, how many vaccinated people get sick versus unvaccinated people get sick. And And as you saw there, you know, unvaccinated people are far more likely to get severely ill than fully vaccinated people in Israel. That's true for every age group. Now, if you look at the overall figure, it doesn't necessarily look that impressive, because there's a lot of elderly people getting breakthrough infections. Um, so, if you look at deaths over the last month or so, roughly, from August 10th to September 8th, according to the Israeli government health ministry's data, actually more people died from COVID who were vaccinated than who were unvaccinated. Um, which sounds pretty crazy, um, and suggests that the vaccination isn't working. But a lot more people are vaccinated than are unvaccinated. So, in fact, if you break it down by age, you find that, well, first of all, very few people under 60 are dying at all from who are vaccinated or unvaccinated. Even if you're unvaccinated, you're not that likely to die from COVID compared to an older person. You might get really sick. There's a lot of serious illness or long-term COVID, but you're likely to survive. On the other hand, people over 60, are less likely to die. More likely to die by quite a lot. And notice, if you break it down by per 100,000, even for the all ages data, which looked pretty bad for the vaccine when you compare just the raw numbers. If you look at it on a per capita basis, where you're taking into consideration how many people are vaccinated versus unvaccinated, then you can see that overall vaccinated people have lower death rates than than unvaccinated people. But here's where it gets interesting. If you break it down by age groups, a lot fewer people who got vaccinated. This is those who got 2 shots. This is those who got 3 shots, boost. Very few of them are dying for the under 60 age group versus unvaccinated people, who also are not dying in large numbers. A third as many per 100,000 for the vaccinated group. But if you look at the over 60 age group, this is where you see the biggest difference. Out of 100,000 people, 161 unvaccinated elderly people, over the age of 60, died per 100,000, versus only 51 per 100,000 who were double vaccinated, and 10 per 100,000 for people who got the 3rd shot, the booster shot. 16 times lower death rate among people over 60 who received a booster shot versus people who were unvaccinated, which there aren't very many elderly people who are unvaccinated in Israel. Over 60 isn't necessarily elderly, but older. So, vaccination clearly helps. But this is an odd statistical phenomenon known as Simpson's paradox, where If you look at overall data, sometimes you know the difference between one group and another group is very different than if you break it down into specific groups. So, in Israel, for example, if you look at data for hospitalization, um, there were only 5 people hospitalized per 100,000 people who were vaccinated versus 16 hospitalized patients for 100,000 unvaccinated people. And, if you break it down further than that, then you find even bigger differences. So, for people under 60, for example, it's looks like about 8 times as many, exactly 8 times as many people who were unvaccinated were hospitalized as vaccinated people. And then for the over 60 age group, similarly, there were roughly 8 times as many. You had roughly an 8 times as high a chance of being hospitalized if you were unvaccinated than if you were vaccinated. At the same time, if you were over 60 and you were vaccinated, you still had a higher chance of being hospitalized with COVID than if you were under 60 and unvaccinated. Now, that all changes when you take into account the booster shots. Um, and again, the data look very different with absolute numbers than with numbers per 100,000. So this is data looking at number of severe cases starting August 14th and going to September 7th. And as you can see, even if you look at just absolute numbers, which is the less impressive way to compare vaccinated and unvaccinated people, folks who received a booster shot have a far lower rate of severe cases than either unvaccinated people, who are mostly most likely to have severe cases, or people who were vaccinated with 2 doses. Let's see. So as of September 13th, again, just looking at raw numbers here, out of 664 severely ill patients, 437, roughly 2/3 were unvaccinated, 168 had received 2 doses, 59 had received the booster shot. But if you break it down on a per capita basis, I assume per 100,000 people, then for every serious case, case of severe illness among Israelis who had received a booster shot, there were 33 serious cases of unvaccinated Israelis in the same age group. So let's scroll down to that data here. I think they have a chart of it. Well, maybe not. But let's look at some different pictures here. So, severe cases per 100,000 people, unvaccinated, partially vaccinated, fully vaccinated, and now if we look at the booster shots, um, impulse is booster shot. I don't know why Google translated whatever the Hebrew term for booster shot is into impulse. But in any case, the light blue here is unvaccinated. The light green is double vaccinated, fully vaccinated, but no booster shot. And the dark green is they had a booster shot. So let's look at this. Okay, we can kind of ignore this because not very many people between 12 and 15 have had a booster shot. So these data are kind of unreliable. But for every other age group, you see the unvaccinated people had the highest number of cases. Fully vaccinated people had lower numbers of cases per 100,000 for every age group. Starting to fade here for the over 90, but still a significantly lower proportion of cases for fully vaccinated. But then look at the booster shot data. In every case, people who got that third shot were far less likely to get infected with COVID-19. And I'm not sure if that's symptomatic infection or just positive test. But in any case, the third shot is helping a lot. But even just 2 shots protects you somewhat against infection. As for getting severely ill, if you break it down on a per capita basis, so you compare the figures for, out of every 100,000 people, how many get severely ill. It ranges from 80 up to about, more recently on September 9th, 160 for people who are unvaccinated. It hovers around 40 for people who got 2 shots, typically back between December and April. And then hardly any severe illnesses for people who got the booster shot. And this is people getting severe illness, and this is people over the age of 60, mind you. So with that third shot, there really aren't that many people proportionally getting severely ill with COVID compared to people who are unvaccinated, or even compared to people who are doubly vaccinated, but they're much lower than unvaccinated people. So, just to summarize, an epidemiologist commenting on people constantly bringing up Israel to spread disinformation that vaccines don't work. She makes the point, again, in a highly vaccinated population, which Israel's moderately highly vaccinated, but their elderly population is extremely highly vaccinated. So people over 60 in Israel, in contrast to the general population, which has a vaccination rate of 61%, because they have a lot of kids in Israel, pretty young population, and of course nobody under 12 is vaccinated, and not that many. I think like a bare majority of those under between 12 and 18 are vaccinated. But for people 60 plus, over 90% are vaccinated. So if you look at the raw numbers of severe cases of people age 60 and up, it looks like the vaccination is not protecting against severe disease in this age group. Because between July 28th and August 25th, the number of vaccinated people, just the absolute number of vaccinated people with severe disease was higher than the absolute number of, the absolute number of vaccinated people with severe disease was consistently higher than the absolute number of unvaccinated people with severe disease. But remember, more than 90% of this age group, 60 and up, are vaccinated in Israel. So, what we've got here, if you judge the efficacy of the vaccine by these raw numbers, not adjusted by the number of people who are vaccinated, this is what we call in psychology the base rate fallacy, because we're only considering, in this case, the number of cases, and ignoring the number of people in the population who have been vaccinated. The partially vaccinated and unvaccinated groups, age 60 plus, are very small in Israel, so their absolute numbers are much lower. But then when we adjust for the base rate, the rate per 100,000 in each population, the rate of severe COVID is much, much lower in vaccinated people. So, for example, for August 25th, the rate of severe COVID per 100,000 people in people over age 60 was about 250 per 100,000 in unvaccinated people over 60, and it looks like about 20 in people who are fully vaccinated. And again, as I showed you the numbers just a minute ago, that's even more true for people who got the booster shots. So for 60 plus, okay, where's severe illness? For 60 plus, they're doing much better if they're fully vaccinated, 2 shots, than if they're not vaccinated. But they're doing far, far better than that if they got that 3rd shot. So, all in all, the data from Israel suggests, just like the data from every other country, that the vaccines are working remarkably well. And just to drive home that point, if you look at data from other countries, you find very, very consistently that vaccines are working very well in reducing all outcomes, infection, hospitalization, death, transmission rate, etc., against not just earlier variants of COVID, but also against Delta. So here's a summary of results out of Denmark. Pfizer and Moderna both protect in the mid-80s against infection. In other words, they reduce the rate of infection by 85 to 89% compared to unvaccinated people, and they reduce the rate of hospitalization by well over 90%. Against symptomatic infection, so you test positive and you've got symptoms of COVID, the data also show somewhat less efficacy of the vaccines against Delta, but still, in every case, considerable reduction in likelihood of getting COVID compared to unvaccinated people. from Germany. Against infection, 85% efficacy, hospitalization, 96%, ICU admission, 97%, death, 100%. So far in that data set, which I don't know how big it is, but thus far, nobody in the vaccinated group has died, and that's against the Delta variant. Study from Los Angeles, California. Unvaccinated were 5 times less likely to get infected with COVID or vaccinated people were 5 times less likely to get infected with COVID than unvaccinated people. So again, efficacy of roughly 85%. And vaccinated people were 29 times less likely to be hospitalized than unvaccinated people. Same sort of picture from the UK, vaccinated versus unvaccinated. From New York City, unvaccinated, much higher rate of getting COVID, and unvaccinated also much higher rate of being hospitalized. And the data did go through August, so that covered when Delta was prevalent. From Ontario, unvaccinated people had a much higher rate of being infected, of being hospitalized, or being in the intensive care unit versus people who were fully vaccinated. So 39 out of 100,000 unvaccinated people got infected versus 4 out of 100,000 fully vaccinated people got infected in Ontario for these data from August. And same for hospitalization and ICU status. Other data for Ontario, same sort of picture. So, you get the picture. No matter where you look, unvaccinated people are far more likely to get infected, hospitalized, become severely ill, or die from COVID. And also, in breakthrough cases, vaccinated people are less likely to infect other people than unvaccinated people. That doesn't mean they can't. It just means that they're less likely to. And if we look at rates of hospitalization comparing different countries, I computed this data the other day. Israel has at the moment about 121 people hospitalized per 100,000 people. That is less than half of the rate of hospitalization of the United States. Excuse me, that's per million people, not per 100,000. The United States has 263 per million people hospitalized currently. Compare Israel, which is falsely claimed to be the most vaccinated country in the world, even though it's just a bit over 61%, with other countries like Spain, Portugal, Canada, Iceland, and Denmark that have much higher rates of vaccination. Spain's not too different from Israel. It's 106 versus 121 vaccination rate, around 75% in Spain, but much lower death rate than certainly the United States, somewhat lower than Israel. Portugal, 56 per million are hospitalized, compared to 121 in Israel, 263 in the United States. Canada, 53 per million. Iceland, 18 per million. Denmark, 22 per million. Those are all countries that have vaccination rates above 75% of the population. So their hospitalization rates are dramatically lower than countries that have 60-ish or less vaccinated, like Israel and the United States. Israel currently, despite claims about how Israel proves that the vaccines are ineffective, has about half the recent death rate of the United States. Over the past week, death rate in Israel is 19 per million. Death rate in the United States is 35 per million. And I didn't calculate it for those other countries that I just mentioned, but all of them, which have much higher vaccination rates than either Israel or the United States, have much lower death rates than either of them. So all in all, then, regardless of the endpoint that you're looking at, whether it's infection, symptomatic infection, severe illness, hospitalization, death, long COVID, transmission, you name it, vaccinated people fare better than unvaccinated people, even in Israel. And, fuck Israel anyway. All right, that's all I have for you today. I will see you next time.